Hi, I'm Greg Kocken, University Archivist at UW Eau Claire. This August, Bob Gough and I will be leading walking tours through Forest Hill Cemetery here in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. This video provides an introduction covering some of the topics and some of the history behind this cemetery that will be explored during our walking tour. We will also create smaller videos which will explore some of the fascinating headstones here in Forest Hill Cemetery.
I'm Bob Gough, and a retired history professor at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. Forest Hill is one of the two cemeteries owned and operated by the city of Eau Claire. There's been over 12,000 burials here, a little less actually than in Lakeview Cemetery, the other public cemetery in Eau Claire. Now, the early history of Forest Hill is kind of murky. They officially organized in 1872, and that's the date on the front of the sexton's office on Emery Street, right across from where we are now. But we do know that there were burials here during the 1860s and even back into the late 1850s. And we're going to go and look at some of these early burial markers on the walking tour. Now, as it developed in the 1860s, Forest Hill was clearly influenced by what was called the rural cemetery movement in the United States, which started in the 1830s and was at its peak in the middle decades of the century. It originated at Mount Auburn Cemetery in Boston, and in Wisconsin, an outstanding example is Forest Hill Cemetery in Madison, which has an excellent website that I suggest that you visit. Now, the idea with the rural cemeteries was to shift burials away from gloomy, small, crowded, unsanitary graveyards next to churches in the downtown urban places. Instead, there now would be spacious cemeteries outside of the cities, having varied topography and extensive landscaping that would make them seem natural, reflecting the Romantic movement that generally characterized America in the mid-19th century. And the underlying idea was to make death and burial seem natural, not some punishment from God or something like that. Now, we can see some of these features in Forest Hill, particularly the trees and the bushes on the slope that goes up from the lower to the upper levels of the cemetery. And the very fact that it's on multiple levels is also a characteristic of these cemeteries. It was Mount Auburn in Boston. It was Laurel Hill in Philadelphia. It was Forest Hill in Madison. You can also know from photographs that there were more trees in the cemetery than there are today. And that was another natural feature that these rural cemeteries had.
These cemeteries were also meant to be educational. The natural environment was supposed to encourage meditating while walking. The design of the burial markers, the symbols, the iconography on them was all meant to send messages, something which I will explore during the tours. Promoting nationalism and patriotism was another goal of the rural cemetery movement, especially at the time of the Civil War. Veteran service records would be inscribed on the burial markers, and flags and medallions specific to a war were planted next to the markers. Rural cemeteries were meant to be for anybody, at least anybody who could afford to buy a burial plot. They would not be denominally selective, for instance. However, class differences were apparent in these cemeteries. Families could show their social status and wealth by building tombs and even small chapels for their deceased loved ones. These structures were generally classical in design, aimed to connect the new Republic of the United States to the supposed republican virtues of ancient Greece and Rome. There are several such structures in Forest Hill, and we'll be looking at several examples. The Forest Hill Chapel, incidentally, which will also be shown on the tour, was built in 1908 by a bequest from lumber baron Henry Putnam and is named in memory of his wife Jane. Rather than classical, its style is Gothic Revival, reflecting the general change in architectural tastes between the mid-19th and early 20th centuries.
As Greg suggested in talking about the design of the chapel, the appearance of the cemetery changes across time. And the eastern half of the cemetery, beyond where the chapel is, looks quite a bit different than this western end, which had been influenced by the rural cemetery movement. In the eastern end, burial markers are generally flat in the ground and made of granite rather than marble. And there's almost no trees at that end of the cemetery. The oldest burials are at the western end of the cemetery on both the upper and lower levels. And that's where we're going to concentrate our attention on the walking tours in August.